Good morning, folks. Thanks to everyone who's joining the call here this morning. We'll give it just a minute as folks come in from the waiting room and get connected. Nice to see some familiar names and faces, as well as some new names. So thanks you all for taking some time out of your Friday morning. We'll just give it just a minute here as folks get situated, and then we'll get started. Folks are just joining. We're just giving it a minute while we all get in from the waiting room and get comfortable. And we'll get started here momentarily. Okay. Well, good morning, and thank you all for joining One Neighborhood Builders for our monthly Fresh Fridays series. My name is Grace Evans-Petanu, the Chief of Staff at One Neighborhood Builders. One quick note as we get started, if you would like to turn on captions for this webinar, you can do so. So first, if you can click captions at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see captions, you can click more or the little icon with 3 dots. And then it will give you additional options and you can select captions. You can then choose your selected caption language and click show captions. And of course, the information is also on the screen there. And then my colleague Allie will also be dropping it in the chat. So One Neighborhood Builders launched this Fresh Friday series to create space for practitioners, community members, policymakers, and other folks who are interested in learning and sharing about community development, especially a topic like that which we will discuss today, which is deeply interrelated with community development, including the maintenance and habitability of homes for people who live there. Today, we'll discuss efforts to make housing and building code enforcement more equitable. And we're excited to have both local and national practitioners join us here today to discuss their work in the space. Couple quick notes on logistics for the day. So first, please note that we will be recording this session as we intend to share it with interested folks who weren't able to join us today. Second, if you have any questions or comments while one of our panelists is speaking, please feel free to type that right into the chat function within Zoom, and we'll try to incorporate it into the conversation. And then towards the end of the session, we'll also have an open Q&A, during which time you'll have the floor to ask as many questions as we have time for. Third, I wanted to remind you that if you hear a phrase or an acronym that you aren't familiar with, we encourage you to ask about it in the chat. So my colleague, Allie Steinberg, will be monitoring the chat and will be jumping in to explain or translate as she's able to. This is a space for learning, and we really encourage folks to use it as such. And fourth and finally, we'd love to get a sense of who is in the virtual room here. So take a moment in the chat function on Zoom, if you don't mind. Say hello, share who you are, where you're joining from, what makes you interested in today's conversation, anything to give us a sense of who we have here joining us. So today we have a special guest moderator, my colleague, Lucy Berman. So Lucy is the Associate Director of Advocacy and Organizing at One Neighborhood Builders, which serves as the backbone organization for Central Providence Opportunities Health Equity Zone, which Lucy will be talking a little bit more about in just a moment here. So Lucy, take it away.
Thank you very much for the intro, Grace. It's an honor to be here moderating today's discussion. I love Fresh Fridays, and Grace and Allie, you always do such a great job with it. So it's fun to get to jump in on this side of things. I'm really happy that all of you are here to join us. Folks viewing this later online, I hope you enjoy the discussion. And we're going to hear from some incredible panelists today who are all advancing very important work around equitable code enforcement. So I'm just going to start with a quick round of introductions. If, as I say your name, you want to just send a little wave so folks know who I'm talking about. We'll start with Libby Benton, who is the Senior Counsel at the Center for Community Progress. Libby, thanks for being here. Cherie Cruz is joining us as well. She's a Rhode Island State Representative for Pawtucket, as well as a tenant organizer with Reclaim Rhode Island. DeeAnn is a community organizer with the Childhood Led Action Project. James Moore is the director of the Department of Inspections and Standards for the City of Providence. And finally, Carrie Zaslow is the executive director for Providence Revolving Fund. Thank you all so much for joining us today. As Grace mentioned earlier, One Neighborhood Builders is the backbone organization for Central Providence Opportunities, a health equity zone, which you've probably heard us refer to many times as CPO-HES. CPO-HES convenes organizations and community members to advance health, economic, and racial equity in the 02908 and 02909 zip codes of Providence, so 9 neighborhoods in Providence. We have 6 priority areas and corresponding working groups for each of those areas, one of which naturally is housing. Our housing working group is comprised of both organizations and community members and has elevated over the last few months equitable and proactive code enforcement as a key priority in our pursuit of housing justice in Central Providence. As you likely know, if you're interested in this subject and chose to join this call, building and housing code play a very important role in regulating how homes are built and maintained in safe and habitable conditions. The housing working group that we've been convening in CPO-HES has highlighted how code enforcement often reflects power imbalances between landlords and tenants, and that in Rhode Island, there are common predatory practices by large landlords and a severe lack of tenant protections. We've heard that folks are hesitant to report code violations for fear of being evicted, and that when they do report them, the problems often aren't actually being fixed. We also know that when enforced equitably, housing and building codes can result in safer and healthier homes and communities. So with all of this background in mind, I'd like to turn to our panelists and ask for their insights and expertise into this topic. So first, Libby, I'll turn to you. I would love if you could introduce yourself and the Center for Community Progress, and then share a bit about what housing and building code enforcement is, and what makes it equitable or inequitable.
Thanks so much, Lucy, and thanks for having me today. So my name is Libby Benton, and I serve as Senior Counsel at Center for Community Progress. We're a national nonprofit that works with communities to help develop equitable strategies to address vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated properties, and to help revitalize neighborhoods. And so our work involves code enforcement because it's one of the most powerful tools that local governments have to achieve those goals. So I think what most folks mean when they're talking about housing and building code enforcement is the process that local governments use to enforce local ordinances, sometimes state laws that govern the maintenance of the interior and exterior of properties. And in our experience, what this has traditionally looked like is local governments, the code enforcement office usually getting a complaint, often from a neighbor about a property, going out and doing an inspection and sending either usually a civil, like a ticket, asking it to be fixed up, or there'll be a fine. And some places even use criminal penalties to try to get the owner to bring that into compliance. And so that's kind of the traditional model of code enforcement. And I think that in the last 10 to 20 years, a lot of code enforcement professionals and others have really realized that oftentimes that model works for some properties, especially those in stable housing markets, or if an owner has resources, but that it falls short for other types of markets and properties. And so it's just not resulting in many properties being brought up to compliance, and it can result in inequitable outcomes. So with the examples of rental properties, Lucy's already touched on it, and I'm sure we'll hear it more today, that if you have a complaint-based system, many tenants are unlikely to come forward to complain because they're worried about retaliation and displacement. And then many landlords, especially those that are out of large landlords, out of state LLCs, even if a tenant complains and code enforcement comes forward, that they'll oftentimes just ignore the complaints or the fines, or just pay them and not fix the property. And then it also shows up for low-income homeowners. It fines and criminal fines and fees can make it less likely that they're going to fix their homes. And then also in an area that we work a lot in with vacant properties. Owners of vacant properties are even more likely than landlords to just ignore those fines and fees and do nothing to fix their properties. So there's been a big move to think about, are there new and better approaches? And lots of cities have been trying these out. And so people have been calling this strategic code enforcement or equitable code enforcement, or code compliance. And in the rental space, we'll hear more about this from everybody, I'm sure, that the main tool folks have been shifting towards has been proactive rental inspection and licensing, which allows the local government to not have to rely on complaints, to be able to take the landlord's ability to rent out the property away, which is a really strong incentive. And then also partnering with social services providers and tenant organizers to help with relocation assistance, with educating tenants about their rights, helping them enforce their rights as kind of a holistic way to help try to bring rental properties up to code.
Thank you so much for that context, Libby. I think it sets us up really well to have a better shared language for talking about this going forward. So with that, I'll turn to both DeeAnn and Cherie, as you've both been working on code enforcement issues in Rhode Island for some time. Can you each introduce yourselves and then speak to how code enforcement affects the residents you work with here? Let's start with DeeAnn and then we'll move to Cherie.
My name is DeeAnn. I'm a community organizer with the Childhood-Led Action Project. We're a nonprofit group that was founded over 30 years ago, mainly by parents of lead-poisoned children. And our goal is to eliminate childhood lead poisoning in Rhode Island through parent support, community education, and advocacy. So for us, lead is a big issue, especially because Rhode Island has such an old housing stock. And though we've made lots of progress through the years, there are still hundreds of children being poisoned in Rhode Island, even this year and last year. So for us, code enforcement is something that is one tool to kind of help get homes towards lead safety. It's not just code enforcement, though. We can also use direct legal action or community organizing. And equitable code enforcement is a big deal because as an institution, code enforcement has definitely been something that has been used to kind of be a tool for racism. So we work with code enforcement across the state to kind of try and like pay attention to what communities want, listen to what the residents want, and then, as Libby was saying, for us, equitable code enforcement means being aware of the fact that there's lots of factors at play to make people not be able to share what they actually want. And I also wanted to say that there's different levels of non-compliance. So having code enforcement prioritize things where we can prevent tragic things from happening, like lead poisonings, is really important while doing things like proactive code enforcement. And yeah, something that we do is trying to get cities across the state to do what Providence was the first in Rhode Island to do, which is to enforce the lead certificate requirement, and getting Rhode Island to be aware that they have the authority to enforce that is something that we're working on. And I'll pass it to Cherie.
Thank you, DeeAnn, and thank you. I like your little guest in the background that showed up for a minute. Yeah, so my name is Cherie Cruz. I work with Reclaim Rhode Island as a tenant organizer. I was a volunteer there. So Reclaim Rhode Island is a volunteer-based progressive organization that came about in 2020, working on social and economic justice until about close to 3 years ago, started working on tenant organizing and seeing just a really large need of tenants and tenants' rights and organizing around conditions of housing. For myself, I was a parent of a lead poison child, about 20, my son's 24 years ago in Central Falls as a Section 8 recipient, and seeing that. And I've been a renter all my life and grew up here in the community where I'm state representative in Pawtucket, Woodlawn, Fairlawn area. And this has been an issue. Like some will say, this is new. It's not new. I'm in my 50s, and conditions have been a concern for as long as I could remember. And I think for us, when we, as a tenant organizer, and out meeting with families in units, especially, throughout the state. So for us, we've been everywhere from Coventry, West Warwick, Pawtucket, Central Falls. And we see some of the main things, especially around equitable and proactive, is really building trust and an open communication and relationship for tenants with code offices. Because unfortunately, what we see is when a tenant does call, and it varies very much, and that's another issue that, going around the state for several years and working with tenants is that, not one office is the same. Not all code officers have the same backgrounds and skills or what they need. And, I was a family visitor for 8 years, and we used to get trainings in healthy homes and things like that. And if someone on this call know what that is, we go into a home and we can spot lead or chipping paint, or at least chipping paint, and then we know where to bring it to get it tested, or to see, if there's other health concerns that we could warrant a call just to make sure that the family's safe within that home, especially against lead poisoning or even carbon monoxide poisoning. So it was eye-opening, at least as a tenant organizer, one, being in my small box in my small area, but seeing across the state of Rhode Island how varying it was from department to department and code officer to code officer. And really the importance of building that, communication and trust, because what was happening, and we were seeing when, simply we think, oh, call code, because that's, something's wrong, call code. Unfortunately, what was happening, or we're seeing happening, is a tenant would call code, and immediately, instead of the code officer coming out, would call the landlord, who then in turn would call the tenant and threaten them to evict them for asking for, minimum housing, standards, getting things fixed, from heat to infestations. And that was really concerning, that we were seeing that. And, so it was like, there's clearly a need here. There's a need to support tenants. There's a need, I heard earlier, to be proactive, so we kind of can get that, on one hand, out of that retaliatory. But again, too, at least from what I know and what I see, code enforcement officers are supposed to come out, do that, then alert the landlord. But also, too, there's supposed to be protections in place against retaliation, because these are things in the law. So I think from seeing that, and, and then we've had some really, positive results where we see code enforcement officers who have been in for 30 years and, come out and really support. So we've seen the relationship really work when it does include trust and communication, where that code enforcement officer is talking to the tenant, making sure that things are being fixed, versus the one way of a code enforcement officer only talking to the landlord and leaving the tenant out of the whole situation, which again, the tenant's the one who called, who has, the health and safety issues. So we thought, wow, this is really striking to see what that looked like. And for another issue that was coming up, and again, with the communication and trust and transparency, so we talk about transparency, is then the code report. We were finding that in different cities and towns, there were different ways that they provided that or not provided that. So tenants who would call to ask for a code inspection, in some cities and towns, it was provided to them a copy. In some, they had to file an access to public records request for their own code report. Some had to go through legal through the municipality. When I talked to some code enforcement officers, it was shared that it was like, there was one that I think of that she said, we used to give these out. They called, we give them a report. That's how it's done, right? How do they know what they need to be fixed, or if there's an unsafe condition in a unit they're paying for? And then it would be a municipality or someone above, and I'll quote one of the officers, someone upstairs says, we can't give it out to them anymore. And that was concerning, that, the health and public safety of residents in a municipality, that someone from the higher up is saying, you know what, we can't give those tenants a copy of what a code inspector sees that may be unsafe to a family. So these were some of the things that really, fueled us. And then, later I'll talk about some of the changes on the state level to look at, and really building relationships again with that communication and trust, but also with municipal judges, so they know that tenants actually exist, right? So we monitor for several years, looking at the courts and following some of the courts, watching, taking notes, and then also talking to the team of code inspectors, but also watching the municipal judges and talking to them and like, hey, what can we do better, and how can we, enforce for things that have been on the books for 40 years, but also to make this better for tenants to be able to be a part of the process, so we can make sure, because what's the end goal? Safe, healthy homes. We just want to get it, fixed. And that's usually when we come up against a landlord, we just fix it. That's it. This doesn't have to be, you just need you to fix it and rent it out. So I'll stop there because there is so much, and I'm so passionate about this area. So I'll let someone else jump in.
Well, we can have somebody else jump in, or we can just go off that transition that you set up for yourself really nicely right there. I would love, if you're okay with continuing to hear more from you just about your other role that you play in Rhode Island. The other hat that you wear in addition to organizing with Reclaim is, of course, as a state representative, representing the Woodlawn and Fairlawn neighborhoods of Pawtucket. So I was hoping, and you certainly don't have to get all the way into it. I know that this week has also been crazy when it comes to legislative work, but if you could speak even just briefly to code enforcement related bills and legislation that you've been seeing come up this year, and what sort of advancement you've been able to make on those.
Yeah, so, and I think, yeah, nicely into two code enforcement bills that I put in, again, talking with code enforcement officers in two cities, and also municipal judges, and seeing successes when tenants are involved. So one in Central Falls, where Judge McConnell, we had a pregnant mom who, there was lead infested. Now, these are units that they moved into with these existing issues, which is another, and it was an important thing as far as what judges do and don't do, or code enforcement officers, or what we can play as far as proactive is, we were able to, as far as by bringing that tenant to the municipal process in front of the judge, where traditionally only a landlord would be, we saw two sides of a story. We saw where a landlord stood there and stated they fixed something that was never fixed, where you witnessed it with your own eyes. And when the tenant was able to come forward to share if those things were completed, that then the municipality, the code enforcement can actually do their job to enforce. Because the code enforcement officers work really hard, and they call the landlord they trust. Okay, you did it. That's great. But just based on that, it ensure that it's completed. So we were able to see that with that, the importance of giving a copy of that code report and notice of when a court hearing is happening in the municipal level. So two of the bills address kind of, they're one of the same coin on both sides. Is like one where, again, when I talked about some municipalities not providing a copy, or they have to file for an APRA request, which I can't, I'm still kind of mind boggled by that, is that one of the pieces of legislation unfortunately did not pass, and both pieces of legislation did not pass around code, is to give a copy. Simply, if the tenant calls and gets an inspection, that code can give them a copy, overriding some municipal variations or whatever concerns they had, that tenant can get a copy of that, and anyone who's impacted. Now, when that's said, it's things like egress and fire. When a whole building, the fire system doesn't work, everyone needs to know that if there's a fire, that fire system is not functional, and it's making sure they get a copy of that. So that was one bill. And that was one where I talked to code officers, and they're like, some who are 30 years said, hey, I used to do this. Like, it's not a problem. We just print it out and hand it to them. It's really not an issue. And then the second was adding on enforcement teeth. Something we have a problem with here in Rhode Island is to a 40-year law that landlords within 30 days are supposed to give a copy to their tenants who are impacted by certain code violations. And that was just simply adding on to that existing 40-year statute that a municipal judge or a code enforcement can have in their toolbox. Hey, we can fine you if you don't provide them a copy. Give them the copy. It's been in law for 40 years. They need to know what's unsafe. They need to know what you're supposed to be working on. Again, we talk about access to units to fix things. Well, if they know on paper what they need to be coming there to do, then, it opens up that line of communication and trust. Unfortunately, those two bills were introduced. We had a big showing of tenants. Unfortunately, we have a larger showing of large corporate landlords who come out and on record will state not even following the existing law or don't want to follow the existing law. So it was quite telling that we've got an uphill battle here as far as health and safety and really looking at creative ways. Another one is state building codes, which did pass, and that really is to and that was part of the speaker's package, and that was really making it more uniformed across the state for building commissioners, because we found out in some municipalities and towns they didn't have code enforcement officers. So who do you call when you don't have a code enforcement officer, and how does that look, and what does that look like? And really providing code, a uniform code education and training to help, really to make it more streamlined and safe overall. So they'll know what they're looking for. And then if there isn't one in your town that a tenant can call, or municipality, they can go up to the state level and have someone, come out and get those certain, code reports or code inspections to make sure those things are done correctly.
Cherie, thank you so much for that insight. I feel like we could go on for so much longer talking more about both all those pieces of legislation, and then also what the process has looked like. The showing of corporate landlords out to testify against that is fascinating. And there is more maybe for a future Fresh Friday to discuss. But for now, I want to turn from that insight into what's happening on the state side of things and look a little bit more narrowly at the city of Providence. By turning it over to James. So James, you've been the Director of Providence Inspections and Standards for just over a year, but it's been a full year with quite a few changes. Could you introduce yourself and talk about you and your department and how you all think about equity as it relates to equitable code enforcement and enforcing code compliance?
Yeah, so James Moore, Director of Inspection and Standards, City of Providence. So the one thing that we have realized over the last year, several things, but the major one is how do we keep tenants from being evicted while we're going through the compliance process. Because the one thing that we don't want to do is we don't want to come in and to an unsafe condition and then provide too much pressure where the landlord takes drastic measures. So we're trying to find a way to ensure that we're walking through the process to get it to safety. We're not just coming in with a firm hand. As you know, with the housing situation here in Providence, there are, illegal basement conversions, illegal attic conversions. And so the one change, and a newer change that was just implemented and we're finalizing with legal, is to send out a letter, not a violation. So it's going to start with a letter. The letter is going to go out and it's going to go to the tenant and the landlord. And the letter will say, hey, we understand you have this situation. Let's have a conversation before we start the violation process. And so then that way, what we can do is it starts the conversation. We piloted the program on over paving. We have a lot of lots that have been overpaved, which create heat indexes, heat islands in the city. And so we started that pilot program that way with conversations. So we're going to take that and transition it over to compliance, code compliance. The one thing that we've seen the unintended effects is, let's say it's a homeowner and they get into code compliance. Some banks are reporting this violation to their insurance company and they're getting dropped. Then they have to scramble to get insurance. So with this, I guess, primer letter, it keeps it away from the violation process for 30 more days as far as the enforcement action. But it doesn't reduce the need for compliance. It just keeps it so then that way we're having more of a conversation instead of the authoritative approach. So because again, yes, we've heard many stories, they call the landlord comes down on the tenant. Well, that's not the primary purpose. The purpose is to get the place habitable. And then once it's habitable, then it can go from there. But that's not our goal. Our goal is compliance, not really an authoritative look at it.
Thank you, James. That's really great insight into what's happening at the city level. And I appreciate all of that explanation. I wonder if we could turn to Carrie now. Something that brings up is, when talking about bringing homes up to compliance, is the real cost associated with doing that. Carrie, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that. If you could introduce yourself and the Providence Revolving Fund and speak to your emerging partnership with the city of Providence and the state, which is, as I understand it, aimed at funding the repairs needed to bring homes into compliance with code.
Yes. So Carrie Zaslow, I'm the executive director of the Providence Revolving Fund. We are a community development financial institution, or a CDFI, certified by U.S. Treasury here working statewide in Rhode Island. Our start as an organization over 40 years ago was really aimed at driving resources to repair homes, at that time specifically in historic districts that were also overlaid by areas that were affected by historic redlining and systemic racism. And that was what we did for a very long time, providing both technical assistance as well as access to very low interest loans in specific neighborhoods. Over the last 6 years, we've really expanded our reach, where we are working on our home repair program. in most areas of the state. I mean, if people call, we'll go out and take a look. Because of our mission as a CDFI, we do have to make sure that we are working with either in low moderate income census tracts or with low moderate income homeowners or renters. So we do have some restrictions there in terms of who we work with, but we're available and out there doing work. What really I think makes our program particularly unique is that we have a construction management team in-house. So our team, when people come to us for a loan, we go out, we do a full inspection of the property and write up a full cost estimate. Now, very often for our borrowers, they cannot necessarily afford everything that's on that cost estimate. So we prioritize by health and safety, code violations, and that this doesn't necessarily mean violations that have been already noted, but things that we've noticed that could be code violations. And we prioritize and make sure that we're able to at least to do that piece of it before we're doing any of the other components. The construction manager who does that cost estimate stays with the project all the way through the punch list. They are there, they monitor, they are out checking on the properties multiple times a week. They make sure that when there are requests for payments, that they're signing off. We pay all the contractors directly, so homeowners don't have to really worry about anybody coming to them. There's not contractors out there bothering people who are living there. If there's problems, they go directly to us and we help resolve them. One of the things that we also do, all of my construction management team, they have all been certified as lead inspectors through the classes. Most of them still need to finish up their hours with another inspector, but they've all gone through the classes so that they're out there also making sure that the work that's getting done is getting done properly and to compliance. And that piece of it really means that not only are we able to provide access to capital to people that often are unable to in neighborhoods that have often been undervalued, but also that we're able to make sure that the technical assistance is there as well. Because of this program, for now, actually the last year, we've been working with the Department of Inspection and Standards on a couple of different programs. One is a revolving loan fund that provides very low interest loans or forgivable loans to people who have a code violation. That's been cited. We work with the department and the inspectors to repair the homes and make sure that we're addressing all of the code violations. And then the City of Providence City Council also passed an ordinance moving about $3 million of ARPA funds into that fund specifically for forgivable loans. And what that means for a forgivable loan is you sign all the sort of same paperwork that you would for a loan, but there's no payments, there's no interest accruing, and it forgives 20% per year. So that at the end of 5 years, if you've remained in the home, then the loan is forgiven and we take the lien off of the property. If the house sells because somebody needs to move, we don't want to make it a challenge for people. It's just the remainder of that loan has to just be paid out of proceeds. One of the things I do want to talk about is sort of what we've seen with this program, and I'll just be brief, which is, we're working very often we are not working with the LLCs or the larger landlords. We're working with landlords that themselves have lower incomes, and where the repairs often have come about because they have because they've not had the funds to do the maintenance, and so they've deferred some of the maintenance, and then we see what has happened. It's a very different process, and it is really, we're working with people in a different way. Obviously, we also tried, we have to work with all the tenants as well, and we do, because we need to make sure that their units are being fixed at the same time that we're doing a lot of the work on the exterior of the property, which is often what we're initially called in to look at. Because when people make those complaints, the neighbors in particular, they don't know what's going on inside. What they're seeing is outside, and that's what they're calling about. So that's often what we're being called in to look at, but we're doing the full inspection of the property. What we also have really done is for many of the properties where we are doing the minimum of or under $50,000 worth of repairs, we are asking landlords to make sure that they have at least 1-year leases with all of the tenants, so that we make sure that at least for that year that there is not going to be either an excessive raise in rent or a removal of that tenant. For projects where we've had to invest more money, whether that is layering lead money or other kinds of funds, we have actually been putting deed restrictions on the property, and those are 10-year deed restrictions, which means that those units have to stay affordable. And quite frankly, and they're on the owner's unit as well, so that if they sell their property, they then have to sell to a buyer that's under 80% area median income. For us, that's part of ensuring some of the affordability piece and making sure that there isn't that sort of retaliation or inadvertent issues. In terms of the cost of repairs, I mean, I think I used to tell people, when I started, I mean, maybe 4 years ago, pre-COVID, that, $25,000, $30,000 was the average of the repairs that we saw. Now I will tell you, I would say about 55, 60 is where we're looking at. And that's part of the problem, is even if you're a landlord, you bought your home through a program at 80, where your income was a little lower. Now it's just a little bit higher because you're getting some rent, and you're trying. If you have to do a 50,000, how are you doing a $50,000 repair? And then what do you do from there? And this is where this program, I think, is really helpful. We are getting ready to launch a program that we're doing with the Department of Housing for the state. That will be available only right now in qualified census tracts through around the state. We're hoping that we can find some additional funds so we can add to more areas around the state. But we'll basically replicating a similar program. In that particular case, we'll be looking at the incomes of both the owners and the tenants. We need to make sure at least 50% of the property is occupied by people who are under 80% area median income.
Thank you so much for that, Carrie. I see some questions in the chat.
Okay, I'm going now.
So we will go ahead and get to those when we get to the Q&A. I just want to make sure that now that we have this really, I think, full picture of what's going on in Providence and Rhode Island more broadly, that we also have a chance to hear from Libby about how you've worked with several cities and towns on code enforcement reform and seen some successes and successful models elsewhere that we could probably learn from. So if you could speak a bit about those successful models and how residents are engaged in the process, as well as how you've seen these processes shift power imbalances and increase tenant power.
Sure, great. I'm happy to. And let me start by saying, I think that you all are doing so many things right in Providence. I'm sure there's a long ways to go, but I'm hearing so much about the great warnings and having these resources to help with the repairs. But to speak a bit to our work, over the last few years, we've helped a number of communities, in a similar position where community organizations and residents and tenants have come together to really want to make reforms to their process. One of those has been in St. Louis, and a process really led by the St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative to really try to rethink how the city's approaching code enforcement. And they have worked with the city to map out what does the process look like, and look through, where are pain points and opportunities for reforms and adding different programs. And so we came in and helped facilitate one-day workshop of folks within the city, and then issued some of our own recommendations in addition to the ones they identified. We also did similar work in Louisville, and in Louisville, it actually came from within the city. You know, after the murder of Breonna Taylor, the whole city had embraced a commitment to doing a racial equity audit of all of their policies and procedures. And so as part of that, we helped the code enforcement leaders and the code enforcement inspectors themselves, you know, walk through, look at their own process through a racial equity lens and identify where there's unintended consequences and ways to advance racial equity. And it was really eye-opening that, you know, the inspectors on the ground were some of the folks that said, identified many of the changes that James mentioned. You know, we want to be able to send warning notices to start conversations with landlords and owners. We don't want to have to issue a violation right away. And then the other big thing they said was the conditions of these rentals are horrible. We want a proactive rental inspection program because we want to be able to help these tenants. And so those were some of the recommendations and that they've been able to implement. And the city just recently passed a proactive registration and rental inspection program. Some other great examples where organizers have been really engaged with code enforcement is in Austin, Texas, a group called Basta Austin actually gets funding from the code enforcement department to really help with that outreach and education of tenants, and even do organizing in the buildings to help prevent the retaliation. And then kind of similarly in Syracuse, New York, they organized kitchen table talks to go out into the community to meet city folks, have facilitated conversations in folks' homes to hear about what are the problems. And then one of the things that came out of that was hiring 4 community ambassadors to really act as liaisons between neighborhoods and residents in the code enforcement department.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure there's a lot more that can be said about each of those examples too. So hopefully we will, in the chat, have some additional resources linked, or perhaps it'll come up in the Q&A.
Yeah, I'll work on putting some links to all those things right now.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you so much to all of our panelists for all of that insight. This has been great, and I feel like I've learned a lot as the moderator, so I hope attendees have as well. For this final 10-ish minutes or so, we'll open it up to questions and answers, which my colleague Allie will facilitate. So I'll pass it off to you, Allie.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lucy, and thank you everyone for sharing your insights. I'll be pulling some questions from the chat that have not yet been answered, as well as I'm going to start off with some questions that were submitted in advance. So I guess to just start off, so as I'm asking these initial questions, get your questions ready and feel free to put them in the chat, or we can start it. If you do the raised hand function, then you can get in line if you want to ask your question directly. So I guess some initial questions. Someone asked, what mechanisms, if any, exist to compel municipalities to enforce state laws? DeeAnn or Cherie, could you speak to this a little bit on like what, or James, around what mechanisms you're seeing in Rhode Island around the role of state law to compel municipalities to comply with code enforcement?
Yeah, I'll jump in just really quickly because, you know, and I was going to add with some of the strategies, some of where we saw it work and we saw landlords held accountable and have to fix their units is when the judge itself and the municipality and the code recommends that, one, they don't retaliate because of this code. So they put it on the record in a court. And then if they do, they're going to be held in contempt. So it gives it more force. It lets a landlord know, hey, you got to fix it, or, you know, we're watching you. So every time it doesn't get before a court, a tenant is weaker as far as being retaliated against, because that judge has that power. And also a judge in that municipal court, which we've seen, and this is where it works, is you cannot rent it out again if they're still the owner. If you cannot rent it out again until those existing code violations are completed. And what we've seen is and we only work with large corporate landlords with very distressed properties. They have many, many units. And what we've seen is they'll sell that building quickly. Within days, we've seen it in one municipality. But because that judge was smart enough to know you can't sell this problem away, because they had so many units. And what they were doing was thinking they could get, and that judge ordered the new owner to come with that, who they were selling, and they had to get those, like they assumed those code violations, and they're still held and liable for them in addition. So those were some really big ones. And then, I just wanted, when James had mentioned about the warning notice, when that happens, I don't know if that stays kind of documented and demonstrates, because this is where the retaliation we're seeing. Because code was called, they don't want to report. They don't want an actual co-report because of that bank, right? So you talked about that. And what we're seeing happening is landlords are requiring tenants to now have the insurance, because the house is so distressed that a bank won't loan it. So they're using tenants' insurance to fix the units. So we've seen these workarounds, and we're like, oh no. But and that's where, are these warnings documented? Does it elongate the time people are living in unsafe conditions that can harm them? And we want to make sure that we're balancing that. But the judge, I wanted to just highlight, is a huge resource, can put it on, on record, and then that's where enforcement can happen and we can protect tenants.
Awesome. Thank you, Cherie. Derek Bowman asked a question in the chat. This one is for Carrie. So for Carrie, for that program you were talking about in Providence with the Department of Inspections and Standards, Derek asked, is that particular program only for cases where the owner has received an official code violation? Could you respond to that?
Sure. So the program that initially started with a revolving fund through the Department of Inspection and Standards, that one actually does. It's a referral that comes often through the housing court when cases are already being adjudicated. However, the additional $3 million of ARPA funds, that does not require that there's already been a cited violation. It is tied to code enforcement. So what I would say is, we go out, we take a look at it. If we see something that we think would be considered a violation, then we talk to the department. They'll go out, they also take a look, and then again, there's no lien. They're not going ahead and putting an actual violation, but they're sending a letter, as James explained, explaining that there was a problem, so that we have it noted, so that it's not just sitting out there without that being noted. But that is where it is tied to making sure that we're addressing code, because what we're not doing is using that fund for sort of just general remodeling. This has to be to correct something. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I often point out is that you could drive around most of the sort of cities of Rhode Island, whether it's Central Falls, Pawtucket, Providence, West Warwick, and you could stop at almost any house, and if you really wanted to look for it, you could probably find a code violation. That doesn't mean that every code violation is the same. And it certainly doesn't mean that at this point there's any enforcement agency that's able to address all of it. So when we have people that are coming to us, obviously we're looking to make sure that we're utilizing those funds in a way that is creating safer, healthier homes.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carrie. Does anyone I don't see any other questions in the chat. If I missed you, please feel free to come off mute and ask your question directly. Does anyone have any questions?
So I don't want to monopolize, but I do have another question for for Cherie and James. So you raised the issue, the importance of like trust for tenants to actually trust the enforcement process, and I really appreciated James, the concern that I also have when I'm working with clients about retaliation and eviction. Many of the clients I work with are families that are already facing homelessness, and so when one of my colleagues comes to me with a family who's housed and says they're worried about, the landlord isn't dealing with the pest issue and it's not safe, I can tell them what their rights are as a tenant, but I can't tell them that that landlord is not actually going to retaliate. And I'm frankly deathly afraid I'm going to give that client advice, and then, next month I'm going to be dealing with my other caseload of families that are struggling to find a place to live. So I just wonder if there are any like practical resources that I can give to clients, especially we work with clients in Providence and Cranston, either to reassure them, or if they are facing retaliation, are there some who can I lean on, or have the clients lean on in cases like that?
Awesome. Yeah, if anyone has any insights, feel free to jump in from the panel. Or Brenda, if you have any insights too.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, they can contact the Center for Justice or Rhode Island Legal Services to talk about it. I mean, a retaliation obviously is a violation of landlord-tenant law. There is, I mean, it's too late probably by the time they get to eviction court, but there are help desks now at the eviction court where tenants and landlords can work together to hopefully negotiate issues. So we had done, it's a little bit out of date and we're in the process of updating it, a guide around healthy housing rights and laws as well too for the city of Providence several years back, and they're in the process of updating that now. And so just trying to get that information out to tenants so that they can give it, know what their rights are at least. The landlord tenant handbook is still a work in progress in terms of updating, but that will hopefully be available soon to give us out as resources to people to understand what their rights and responsibilities are.
And I'll just jump in, Derek, because, we see this every day. We have a couple retaliation cases actually playing out in the courts. And what's important for tenants, and that can look in the form when they call code and then they get that 30-day printed out, not even a legal document notice. That's their like 30-day notice, right? They tag it on the door, send it through the email because they called code. But it's important for someone from code like James that it documents, yes, that tenant did call, and somewhere along the line the landlord got wind of it, and now they've got an eviction notice, right? And so it's important that it's documented for the tenant side, because yes, it is against the law. Retaliation's against the law. It's proving it. So we want to make sure our tenants know to document when they call code, document anything they have, always do it in writing by email, because there's so many retaliation cases, but they either get thrown out or they can't be brought. Like, I'm at the courts almost every day, and like they won't take it, like CFJ, they can't take it if you don't have proof of it. It's just real. So we want to make sure tenants document things if there is an issue and they call and then that happens and it's retaliate. One, you want to make sure then CFJ RILs can do their job and enforce those retaliatory and predatory behaviors of some of our landlords. And unfortunately I see it from these large corporate landlords the most. I mean, the small mom and pops like Carrie, they need that program. We don't see those issues with our smaller mom and pops. We see it with the ones who own 3, 4, 5, 1,000 units across the state, which is a real issue. But they do this systemically and systematically throughout they've got a real, every month they send these out, whoever calls, and they just rinse and repeat and add new tenants in, and they just think they have to leave when they get that notice, when it's clearly retaliation. Half of our evictions are not for non-payment. They're because tenants were like forced out because they asked for repairs.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cherie and Brenda, for that context. That's really helpful. And so as we're nearing 9:45, I want to take this opportunity to thank our panelists for their time, insight, and expertise this morning. As we can see from this topic, we're just scratching the surface here. This is meant to kind of give us some language to open up this conversation, and I think give us some more questions to think about. And I also want to thank all of you who took time out of your Friday morning to join us. We hope you'll consider joining us at a future Fresh Friday. We're taking the summer off, but we'll be back with our next Fresh Friday in September. And if you are here today, you'll receive an announcement about the next session. Please note as you exit the Zoom meeting this morning, a brief survey regarding today's event will pop up in the browser on your device. It'll ask you a couple questions about today's session, so please take a minute or two to respond. It'll help us continue to provide engaging and helpful experiences at Fresh Friday in the future. So thank you all, and I hope you have a great Friday.